Race transformations are very powerful spells, unlocked throughout the Tomes of Magic in Age of Wonders 4. There are minor and major race transformations, and all of them are somewhat expensive spells to cast, but provide universal, long-lasting buffs and benefits to your people, an entire race, as you transform them and equip them with new upgrades. And in this video, I'm going to break them all down and rank every race transformation. It's important to note that minor transformations are cast and can be generally stacked. There are no exclusions. You can cast them on any race that you're the keeper of, including, of course, obviously your starting race, but also those that you may bring into the Empire. Major race transformations work a little bit differently. They tend to be more expensive, and you can only have one major race transformation at a time. That's all you really need to know about these transformations and unlocks. And in this tier list video, I'll be considering their overall power level, the unlock criteria, when and how much, any synergies that likely exist, and exclusions, things that these prevent you from doing, as well as their overall opportunity cost. Speaking of which, the opportunity cost of leaving a like and subscribing is very low, and I'd appreciate it on these high-effort videos. Let's roll. And naturally, of course, the Tome of Beasts is the beautiful place to start in nature, and here we're dealing with Animal Kinship, a minor race transformation spell that grants two nice abilities, providing that you're adjacent to a friendly animal or cavalry unit. I would note, of course, there's plenty of synergy for animal units here. I mean, we've got Summon Wild Animal right next door, and it keeps going throughout. So this shouldn't place too much of a restriction on you, although there is a slight one. You need that unit type, and you need to be adjacent to it. Feudal empires will, of course, do very well here. You'll receive plus 10% damage across the board, and a plus 10% critical hit chance. This potentially gives you the ability to deal an extra 50% damage if your morale is high, or because of this extra chance. I think this is a very powerful early unlock. There is some slight penalties that should probably be applied for the fact that you do need to be both adjacent and it has to be to an animal or cavalry unit, though the strong synergies within the tome help to make up for that a little bit. Beasts was a very powerful place to start, and I think that this one is worthy of either an A tier or potentially actually an S tier. If I was placing it in A, I would be doing so only because of the drawback of needing to be adjacent to those unit types. If I was placing it in S, I would draw on its incredible strengths of being unlocked basically from turn 1, right? You just need a couple of turns to get this thing online and out there in the world, and then you have it for the rest of the game. 10% extra damage and a critical hit multiplier. I think this is a very powerful start, and I'm ranking it at a high A tier. Actually, an S tier. This is one that I've grappled with a lot when I was planning this video and deciding where to put things. That's why I'm so on the fence about where to put it. I am going to leave it there. Next, we have the Tome of Glades, a tier 2 tome, of course, inside of the Nature Affinity, and we unlock Leaf Skin. Leaf Skin lets us be people of the forest, and of course there are later synergies throughout the tome. Here we receive two benefits, Forest Walk and Forest Camouflage. Forest Walk, of course, allows us basically to move faster through forests, using less movement points, and then Forest Camouflage allows us to be undetected. Potential, of course, here to sneak up on an unsuspecting foe. We can create forests if we want to here, terraforming, so again, the synergies exist to get this benefit online. I'm just not entirely sure that it really provides a lot of benefit. Okay, I can camouflage myself inside of forests, potentially hiding from enemies or sneaking up on them, and I can move a little bit faster, which is nice, but ultimately actually not that much of a benefit. While we can create forests, I can't guarantee that there'll be a huge number of them on your map. That's completely out of my control. What I can guarantee is that there are plenty other benefits that provide a much stronger yield than this does. Not to start in too much of a polarizing position, though we have, I think that this one is deserving of either a C or a D tier ranking. For me, it's a D tier. It just doesn't deliver enough benefit across the board. Largely, its benefits are only to my units moving around the map, and potentially it's just for a sneak attack. I don't think this delivers enough benefit to warrant anything higher than a D tier. And inside of tier 3, the Tome of Vigor, Nature Affinity, we have Supergrowth. A pretty fascinating one. Supergrowth provides a flat benefit of plus 10 hit points. That's great. Just a generically good buff to our units. Also, +1 retaliation attack. This is quite useful. Again, synergies potentially with those feudal empires and what we've already built. Here it's about zone of control. Melee units can retaliate once per turn by default. And here we receive a +1 to our retaliation attack. Attacking on enemy units, of course, when they come within our zone of control or try and leave it. Nice pickup. And finally, a decreased number of units in formation. This is a slight benefit in terms of how casualties are calculated, and we'll see the opposite side of this come through very shortly in a different tome and a different buff. Here, decreasing the number of units will potentially decrease the amount of casualties that we're taking. Fewer units means fewer spooked units, fewer destroyed units. And so we may reduce the chances of fumbling or fleeing the battlefield through this slight benefit here too. Supergrowth is unlocked obviously quite a bit later than the rest. It's tier 3. We don't tend to see minor race transformations come much more expensive than this one, though I think it has strong universal benefits. And it's for that reason that I'm ranking it at a high A tier. Our friends over in the order tree miss out quite a bit, unfortunately. They only receive one minor race transformation inside of their tome. Here it is. It's Anointed People, providing +3 status resistance and +3 spirit resistance. +3 tends to be the best yield that we see for resistances out of the tomes, out of the race transformations, so that's great. This one, of course, will reduce the chance that we're afflicted by negative status effects, and we receive 3 resistance to spirit damage. I can't really knock having extra resistance against status effects. That's really nice, could be very strong. The spirit resistance is, of course, a bit more focused, but it's a fairly strong buff to it. Anointed People, for me, at a tier 3, more expensive, just isn't quite as good as Supergrowth. That was my starting point for ranking it. Then I considered how strong are the benefits overall. Resistance, reducing status effects, I think it's a nice pickup. I don't think it compares to the power level of other things on this list, and therefore it deserves a slightly below average ranking when I consider the opportunity cost, the unlock, synergies, and overall power. I think it's a C tier. There are 2 hiding inside of the Astral Affinity. Firstly, at the tier 1 Tome of Warding, basically from the start of the game you can receive magical wards, +2 lightning resistance, +2 fire, and +2 frost resistance. So across the board, a little bit of resistance against some of those magical wards, magical spells, I should say. Here it's generally quite universal, right? Lightning, fire, frost, a lot of the things that we'd like. And +2 is decent, but not overwhelming. You might be faced with attacks that are dealing 6. Potentially, you're taking away 33%. It's a nice buff, absolutely, and a cheap one to get. I think that magical wards is rightly placed at either an A or a B tier. It does depend, of course, a little bit on the makeup of the map, who you're versing, and all of those kinds of things. In this case, I'm going to place it at a B tier, thanks to its universal strength and defense, and relatively cheap unlock, lifting it up above something that could be ranked at C, for example. And inside of the Tome of Amplification even, we have Astral Blood. Astral Blood just does one thing. Attunement Fortune. Gives us 1 fortune whenever a spell is cast. This will increase our critical hit chance, as you can see, by 10%. The beauty here, though, is that it stacks up to 5 times, right? So it's actually a lot more powerful than it might look at first glance. The other thing to note is that it's when spells are cast. Spells are cast quite often. By you, probably, inside of this Tome of Affinity, but also the enemy as well. So it's fairly easy, actually, to start stacking this fortune, giving you potentially +50% to your critical hit chance. Not too shabby at all. Unlocked at tier 2, so fairly middle of the road for the minor race transformations. I think that Astral Blood is a really nice pickup. As far as race transformations go, I think that Astral Blood sits around average to higher average, so it's looking at around an A or a B tier. I could settle for either of those, but my final ranking was at the B tier. It's certainly strong to increase your critical hit chance, but there are plenty of other factors at play here, like the opponent using morale damage against you to reduce your chances or make you fumble, and I think therefore it deserves a middle-of-the-road ranking. Somebody at Triumph really liked Chaos, or at least they wanted to put a lot of minor race transformations. Unlike Order, who had 1, Chaos has 4. We're starting with Spawnkin. Spawnkin is unlocked. Again, it's one of these ones potentially right from the start. Tier 1, Tome of the Horde. This increases the number of units in our formation. which is the opposite to Supergrowth, which is why this one is incompatible with it. This makes it for a slight negative penalty, actually. Having more units in our formation will make us more likely to suffer casualties and therefore suffer the negative afflictions and penalties that come with that. So that is a slight drawback. However, it's met with a very powerful benefit, plus 20% damage, almost right from the start of the game, an additional 20%. There is a slight penalty that I do need to subtract from having more units in your formation. This will impact certain types more than others though, right? If you only have just one unit, maybe it's a big unit, then that's going to hurt you a lot. If you are potentially going with more of a horde mentality, lots of units, then this will have less of an impact, potentially here inside of this class and inside of the likely builds. It's not as much of a big deal as it could be. Spawnkin deserves either an S tier or an A tier. 20% extra damage is great. I was quite on the fence initially about placing it at S tier because of that unit number factor, the morale factor, the critical hit factor. But for me, I am ranking this at an S tier, plus 20% damage across the board. Doesn't matter what damage type you're doing, you're getting 20% extra from turn 5, turn 6. I think it's great. S tier. At tier 2, inside of the Tome of Revelry, which is all about that morale and experience, we have Reveler's Heart. Reveler's Heart has one thing it does it quite well, plus 50% morale from all sources. So 50% extra. If you're getting 10, now you're going to get 15. It's from all sources across the board. It is, of course, focused on one specific mechanic of combat, and that's morale. But it's a really important one, so I can't detract too much from that. 50% bonus is nice. I find Revelry a little bit harder to measure than others, though. I want to make that quite clear. I'm putting this Dark Heart at a B tier ranking, partly because I think it's a little bit more difficult to manage, as I say, than the rest, a little bit more difficult to rate than the rest, for me at least. And the benefits are potentially huge or non-existent. For that reason, I'm ranking it at the middle of the road, a B tier. Stepping up a notch to tier 3, we have the Vessels of Chaos. This one again is a single ability buff, plus 10% damage for each of the target's negative status effects. This one stacks 3 times, so plus 10, plus 20, plus 30 for negative status effects. If you're researching down the pandemonium pathway and a little bit of chaos, you're likely going to have a lot of abilities, a lot of ways to cast status effects on the enemy. I think, therefore, the amount of synergy that's on offer does a pretty good job at reducing the fact that we require those negative status effects to get any benefit out of this whatsoever. I think it's fairly safe to assume that you can pull off a plus 20% damage out of this, with, of course, the ability to push it up to plus 30%. The qualifier of negative status effects does factor into my mind, and a slightly higher cost. The extra damage that can be output from Vessels of Chaos, and I would argue generally will be output by the Vessels of Chaos, makes it easy, or at least fairly straightforward, to counterbalance any status resistances that the opponent may have, their +1 defense, their +2 defense. Easy to overwhelm that with the extra damage here. The qualifiers, though, do knock it down from an S tier. I think having to impact status effects reduces it down to, initially I'd placed it at a B or an A tier. I think for me it's a low A tier. And then, very unusually, up at tier 4, we have a minor race transformation and chaos channeling. Of course, the tier 4 tomes will require that you've already invested in chaos, right? You need to have 6 affinity to be able to unlock it, for example. I'm not going to deduct much from that because you probably already will if you're going down this path. But I should note, much more expensive in cost and initial build-up than a lot of the other minor race transformations. Important to keep that in mind. Here we receive +4 fire resistance from the flames. We also receive Vengeful Flames, which means that our melee hits will deal 2 fire damage, and we have a 30% chance of burning. Burning is very good, dealing 8 fire damage per turn. At a 30% chance, which damages melee attacks though, you will pull this off, but it's not massive. And finally, we have Fiery Wake, which will burn all of those obstacles like those flowers in front of us on the terrain as we move across. This one is quite interesting. very expensive in comparison to the rest, and I'm not sure it delivers enough power. The fire resistance, don't get me wrong, is very nice. Being immune to flames is great because we're lighting them all over the place. In terms of damage output, it's non-existent. Empire impacts also pretty non-existent. It's an interesting one because it is just so expensive to get out in comparison to the rest of the minor race transformations, and I'm also not sure that you would pick this one over another option at tier 4, which we'll discuss later in the piece. Of course, the caveat being it's a major race transformation. For me, this just doesn't really deliver enough power at all. For that reason, I would initially actually had placed it at the D tier just because it really didn't compare to the rest, though I think it is potentially worthy of a low C tier ranking because of some of the benefits it brings in, and I also shouldn't assume that you'll be likely to move towards the major transformation here, because minor transformations can be synergized with all of the rest. For that reason, I'm ranking it at a C tier. Moving on to Materium inside of its tier 1 tome, start of the game, basically we have Earthkin. Earthkin is very similar to the forested version Leafkin, it's leaf skin that we'd looked at earlier on. In this case, of course, it's about rocks. So we receive rock camouflage, we can hide in the rocks in the mountains, and rock walk. So we'll be able to move faster through rocky terrain. We do receive one additional benefit here, though, +1 defense, reducing physical damage, +1. It's a nice little benefit on top of the terrain-based camouflage. In this case, we are less likely to be able to terraform our rocks early on like we were with the forests, though. We'll have to wait a bit longer to maximize that benefit, though, as I said, with our foresty friends, I don't think this benefit is particularly noteworthy. I rank Earthkin 1 higher than Leaf, purely because of that extra defense. And again, of course, it shares some similarities, in this case, slightly cheaper, unlocked at tier 1, great, a little bit of extra defense is always nice, but that's all it does. It's +1 defense, as far as I'm concerned, especially early on. The rest of the movement penalties, benefits, I should say, don't really give you a lot, and for that reason, it's a C tier. Skipping up to tier 3 in the Tome of Transmutation, we have Steel Skin. Steel Skin builds on the defense that we may have picked up earlier with our Rock Skin. In this case, giving us +2 defense as well as +2 to Blight, with a -2 to lightning resistance. So there's a bit of specialization. There's a strong theme, of course, here around the lore of having that steel skin, and it provides us with some extra defense and Blight at the tier 3 unlock. The resistance is nice, definitely, and it's one of the few ways that we can grab some physical defensive damage, so I have to keep that in mind. I'm also thinking, though, that across the board, it's not a huge benefit. The numbers that are applied aren't massive at 2, though still significant. For me, I think that Steel Skin deserves a C tier ranking. Doesn't quite deliver enough power for me to want it up any higher than that. Tier 3, so it's a bit more expensive than most of the other things we've looked at, and I'm pretty happy with a C slot. And then right up the top again at tier 4, of course, the most expensive that the minor race transformations can be, we have Gold Touched. Now, Gold Touched is a bit unique in that it's one of the only ones that give a direct impact to the yields of the Empire, to the Empire's direct growth. In this case, +1 gold per population in cities. At this point in the game, maybe you've got 4 cities with 10 pop, maybe 5 with 10 pop. You could be looking at around 40 or 50 additional gold per turn. A nice benefit. And again, rare. We also receive +2 resistance. I'm a big fan of this resistance, potentially slightly better than some of the others in that it's reducing all non-physical damage +2. A nice universal benefit to being gold touched, and some money to be made from this relatively expensive minor race transformation. I think that the resistance that we get here is better than most, and having the extra gold in the Empire is great. Gold, potentially not as useful as something like knowledge, but can be much more universally applied. Buildings, units, quick upgrade, etc. I think that this one is deserving of either an A or a B tier. It's one of those ones that, like a couple of others, I sat on the fence on this one for quite a while, ranking it. Is it too expensive to place at A? Should it really be placed at B? These were the things that I was grappling with, and I ended up settling on a high B ranking. But again, you're welcome to fight me on that one. And now we move to the shadows, my friends, with Tome of the Doom Herald at tier 2. This is a minor race transformation that lets us steal morale from the enemy. So every time we attack them, we'll steal 3 morale per hit. So we're taking it from them and we're adding it to us. So it's a nice 2-pronged effect. This will, of course, as we've already mentioned, impact our critical hit chance for an extra 50% damage, or potentially we fumble, maybe we even run away if we're low on morale. This is a nice benefit applied universally to combat. I quite like it. Inside of a tier 2 tome, with obviously some reasonable synergies here too throughout the affinity and the tome itself, I think this is a pretty good one. It was one, go figure, I sat on the fence a little bit. For me, I think it's a B tier. It's unlocked early enough. -3 or +3, depending on who's losing it, the enemy, and who's getting it, you, is a good benefit applied universally across combat, though there are plenty of ways to counter this kind of thing too. For me, I think it sits at B tier. And inside of tier 3, the Tome of the Cold Dark, we have Frostling Transformation, which gives us 3 frost resistance. It also makes us immune to being frozen. We receive +10 morale while we're walking on or fighting in cold terrain, and Arctic Walk, which allows us to move through it quicker. So we're seeing some things like leaf skin, for example, that benefit from terrain. In this case, we can't hide in it, but we get extra morale. We're immune to frozen, and we get some frozen resistance. Strong focus here, strong internal synergies. The benefits, though, again, like I don't really rate Arctic Walk all that highly. 10 morale is great, but you're going to need cold terrain to make it work. We then have some immunity to freezing and a little bit of frost resistance. I don't think that Cold Dark is necessarily a bad tome that this sits within, though I don't think it's the strongest one either. And I think that Frostling Transformation at tier 3 is certainly a reasonable pickup, though it doesn't quite have the synergies or strength that a couple of the others at this class and at this level have. For me, this one is just slightly too specialized and just not quite impactful enough across the board for me to rank it at a B tier, so I choose to place it at a C tier ranking. Now we move on to the really juicy stuff. These major transformations, as I've mentioned, do have some prerequisites around them, some restrictions. Major race transformations can only be carried out once, for example. So you need to keep that in mind, that all of these are fighting against each other for your support. They want you to choose them, and you can't pick the rest. The other thing to note is that they, of course, are generally more expensive. Here we're looking generally at tier 4, so much more of an upfront cost, and you will, of course, need to have researched into the tome and have at least 6 affinity points inside of it. I'm going to assume you probably do. Here we have Tome of Paradise. This is Gaia's chosen major race transformation. It provides us with charge resistance, making us better against shock units so long as they don't charge at us heavily. We also receive +3 status resistance, so those negative status effects be gone, +3 anyway, and an across-the-board buff of 20 hit points. That's twice as much as we saw earlier on from some of the minor race transformations. This is great, make us stronger, more resistant to casualties, and generally better in the fight. Status resistance +3. I'm not quite sure if that's a major ability. That feels a little bit more like something we might see in a minor transformation. The charge resistance is quite specialized. A nice ability, though, of course, because you'll be able to counter some of your weakness here. But, again, quite specialized. And then we receive a 20% hit points. This is the opposite, universally applied. Great. Because the major race transformations are in much more direct combat with one another, I will be applying a little bit more of that mindset, that unlock. When do I get it? How much does it cost? And crucially, what is it being excluded from, or what other things are being excluded by it? It's for that reason that I'm ranking this one at either a B or a C tier. It depends on how harsh I wanted to apply the penalties. For me, I'm going to place it at a B tier. I'm going to choose to, of course, apply a penalty for it being a major transformation, but I'm not going to let that knock it down any lower. I think that the 20 hit points is universally good, and there are some reasonable synergies here to up your resistances too. For me, it's a low B tier. I want to make that really clear. If I could literally put it on the fence, I would, but I can't. So for me, it'll bounce between these two and likely land at B. Order strikes back. Having only one minor race transformation, it comes back with a major one, of course at tier 4. This is a very fascinating one. Angelize, baby. We become a celestial unit. +2 to spirit resistance, -4 to blight and frost. And we get this control loss immunity, which makes us immune to the mind control berserk things that other tomes might be forcing on us. We also become flying units. This is very good. +2 vision range. We can move across any terrain at a movement cost of 5, so we don't need forested legs. We require seafaring to get across water, still important to note, and we can move past other units, which is really handy, actually, on the battlefield, and obstacles in combat too. Finally, we receive a -10% reduction to our unit upkeep by being faithful. I think that the flying movement is super good here. Celestial unit type, of course, you have to factor those changes to resistances in mind, and we're likely to save a bit of cash too, potentially 20 or 30 gold, depending on how we're building our army and just how big our army is. A major race transformation that lets us pick up a new unit type, I think, does deliver kind of a next level benefit, right? It's major for a reason, and here we see why. The benefits are universally applied. They're generally pretty good, factoring in some changes to resistance. And I think across the board, becoming an angel is worthy of an A-tier ranking. Our major race transformation in the Tome of Astral Convergence is an interesting one. Instead of changing our people, this one focuses on boosting the Empire. Although we do receive a slight change in that we can pass through things. The unit can move through obstacles now, thanks to our links to the Astral Sea. We'll all be able to do that. The real potential benefit here comes from the Empire development. In this case, we receive +1 mana and +1 knowledge, which will be very impactful for maybe reaching towards a magic victory or simply unlocking more units and spells per population. Slightly later in the game, perhaps you've got 5 cities with 10 pop each, or a few less with more population. You should be looking at around 50 or 60 mana and knowledge per turn, thanks to this major race transformation. It is, of course, unlocked early. No, it's unlocked very late in the piece, right? It's a major race transformation, tier 4. There should still be plenty of game to come, though, not just because you're likely pushing towards a magic victory here, potentially an expansion one. I think that there's enough of a game left that you can get a lot of value out of the extra mana and extra knowledge. It's also quite a rare ability in that it's applied directly to our empire and our people, our populations, rather than our units. Astral Attunement therefore places itself in quite a unique spot. Unlike the rest, which are largely focused around morale, damage, and that kind of thing, resistance, this one doesn't really, except for the fact that we can pass through, which, you know, that's actually really strong, so don't let me feel as though I'm downplaying that to you here. The real benefit comes from the extra empire development. For me, it's either an A or an S tier. And while I'm placing these rankings, I am kind of thinking that the minors and the majors could be separated onto different lists. I'm making this list with that implicit inside of it, that you could just look at the majors or just look at the minors and get a good perspective, and then we'll combine them all together, factoring in costs, when we get it, and what it does. For that reason, and all of the reasons I've discussed, I think that this deserves an S tier ranking. Jumping back to Chaos, which of course had a minor race transformation at tier 4 inside of Chaos Channeling, inside of Chaos Demon Gate, rather, we receive something even more interesting, Demonkin. Here's our major race transformation. This one, of course, is almost the spiritual opposite to evangelizing ourselves. In this case, we become Demonkin. So all of our units become demons, granting burning immunity, so resistance to burn, and faster movement on desolate terrain. Again, I don't overly rate the walking abilities, but being immune to burn is nice. And of course, it shared that with the minor race transformation inside of Chaos Channeling. Here we receive flying. So again, we're just like the angels with our +2 vision range, our extra movement or our better movement across any terrain. And we can safely pass through or move over obstacles, something that's shared, of course, as you can tell, with a lot of these transformations. And finally, we receive Frenzy. When the unit lands an attack, it gets +10% damage, and that stacks, you guessed it, up to 5 times. Slightly more difficult potentially to pull off attacks. Maybe this is slightly worse than the likes of, casting a spell to get an extra 10%, because that could be done by the enemy. Here, though, of course, we could retaliate. There are plenty of ways to attack, and I think that this strengthened buff can be fairly easily applied and stacked on top of our flying units, who are Demonkin, immune to fire. I think that this one is a very powerful major race transformation with huge synergies inside of the class. Demonkin for me deserves either an A tier or an S tier. I think it slightly edges out the benefits of our angelic friends, and I think it has a slightly stronger synergy with the things that you've likely already picked up and unlocked. And for that reason, I'm placing it at an S tier. And last but not least, we have a pretty interesting one. This is the Tome of Great Transformation. It's a tier 3 tome. However, we unlock our major race transformation here. That means that this one, unlike the rest, is unlocked much earlier on, and it also doesn't necessarily require us to have any shadow affinity, though you may want to. Here we have Wightborn. This one is fantastic and quite interesting. It gives us the undead unit type, so all of our units will become undead. +2 frost resistance and +2 to blight. However, -4 to spirit and fire. We also receive a -100% modifier to morale changes. This one is a little bit complicated to unpack and understand. Potentially, though, we're likely to get some strong benefit out of this, though there could be some drawbacks that could arise. And finally, we're immune to poison as well, so take that in nature. How do you like me now? The real power, I think, here comes from the lifesteal ability, though. If you're not a mana addict and you didn't pick this up from the start, this is golden, and it's unlocked at tier 3. Units gain lifesteal, so for each of their hits, they steal 10 temporary hit points. Or actually, more accurately, I should say they gain 10 temporary hit points, because it's actually just a heal ability. You're not taking it from them and adding it to you. Repeating attacks can also stack on top of this, adding an extra 5 temporary hit points. This is great, though, because as we deal damage, maybe we're dealing 15, we also heal, maybe for 15. This is super strong. A wonderful ability for our undead units, which we likely have great synergy for, and it's unlocked earlier than the rest. For me, the great transformation that's unlocked here is worthy of an S tier, potentially one of the best. As I mentioned, that early unlock does set it slightly apart from the rest. Fewer exclusions and restrictions that we need to place or factor in when we're developing our affinities and our empire. The abilities themselves are great too, with a real focus on lifesteal being the MVP situation. There are some drawbacks, of course, but I think that they're offset well, and this is a very strong pickup and an S tier for me. And that, my friends, brings me to the conclusion of this tier list video. What do you reckon about my rankings here? I'm happy to take a screenshot and save this as done. I think we've factored in opportunity cost and power and all of those sorts of things and produced a fairly good tier list. Don't get me wrong, there'll be plenty of people who will disagree with me below. The comment sections on these tier lists are not necessarily the nicest place, but actually also it's a great way to learn something new. And when I was developing and researching this tier list, I leaned on a lot of the good information that came out of the comment sections in previous ones. So thank you for that. Finally, I'd like to return here at the end, in this sort of concluding section, for a little bit of concessions. I think that there are a few things on this list. I mean, let's be real. All of them could be reevaluated and readjusted based on your personal biases and experiences and how you're laying out the criteria. But I think that there are a few that were so marginal that I could also make a second version of this list. It's a second version that would see our demons put next to our angels, and likely placed in an A tier, acknowledging the extra strength of unlocking this one earlier on. I think that also there's another pairing here out of our Supergrowth, our unit transformations, that could see these two placed in the same tier level, either both at A or both at S. And there are potentially a couple of concessions further down as well that I might like to change around. Something like Steel Skin, for example, might like to move, or the Rock Skin with the extra defense early on. By and large, also maybe Golden Realm could see a move, as well as the final one for the Astral Affinity as well. I think that that is potentially worthy of actually being slightly lower down around the A to Bs. But other than that, minor movements with some concessions given, I'd be pretty happy with either the first version or this version. Again, you could take them and lift them up or down one either way and make a fairly solid case regardless. But thank you so much for joining me in this tier list video, and I'll see you all for more Age of Wonders 4. Take care, everybody.